When I first walked into their house, the smell of home-cooked meals and the faint notes of old wood greeted me. It was a family friend's home, and we were invited over for dinner, as we often were. These gatherings were usually dull for someone like me, an only child, until the grandkids showed up. They were my age and made these evenings somewhat bearable. This time, though, things were different. There were 5 of us, the regular grandkids plus a couple of new faces. The unfamiliarity in the air was electric, like a storm waiting to strike. I could feel it. And maybe, just maybe, I hoped for it. The usual distractions like Legos or tag in the yard didn't seem to cut it. We needed something more stimulating. In one of the back bedrooms, dusty and cramped with relics of forgotten memories, we stumbled upon something peculiar, an old Ouija board. It wasn't the shiny, store-bought kind with bright letters and polished wood. This board looked ancient, its edges frayed, and the letters faint as if they had been whispered over for decades. It called to me in a way I couldn't ignore. "Let's play," I said, my voice low but commanding. The others hesitated, exchanging nervous glances, but eventually curiosity won. We set the board on the floor, its worn surface glowing faintly under the dim light. The planchette was cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so. I'd never played with one before, but I had an idea of how it worked. Or maybe the board had an idea of how I worked. Either way, I was ready. We started with the usual nonsense. Who's going to get married first? Who will be the richest? The planchette moved sluggishly at first, guided by little nudges and giggles from the group. I could feel the faintest resistance as though the board was toying with us, humoring our childish questions. But the mundane was never enough for me. I craved something darker, something real. My turn came, and I leaned in, locking eyes with each of them as I asked, "Who will be the first to die in this room?" My voice was steady, almost daring. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you and makes you feel like you're being watched. The planchette hesitated, then began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it spelled out ATTS. My heart pounded as I watched, the realization dawning on me. It wasn't just random letters. It was my last name, spelled backward. OR. The planchette stopped. I pulled my hand away as though burned, but the cold sensation lingered on my fingertips. The others didn't know my last name, let alone how to spell it backward. I'd been careful about such things. They stared at me, their faces pale and unsure. I let out a low chuckle, breaking the tension. "Guess I'll live the longest then," I said with a grin that felt more sinister than reassuring. They laughed nervously, eager to move on, but the air in the room had shifted. Something had changed. Over the years, the memory of that night haunted me, not just because of what the board spelled, but because of how it made me feel. Powerful, connected to something ancient and dark. 40 years later, I've lost contact with those kids, but sometimes I wonder, did any of them feel it too? Did they sense what I'd done, what I'd unleashed? Because I do. Every single day. The years that followed were quiet on the surface, but the events of that night never truly left me. I felt something shift in me that evening, something that started as a whisper and grew louder with time. My fascination with the occult deepened, a secret I nurtured with books I'd borrow from obscure libraries and conversations I sought out with anyone who seemed to know the darker side of life. It was during my teenage years that the dreams began. Night after night, I'd find myself back in that dimly lit bedroom. The Ouija board would be there, its letters glowing faintly, almost pulsing like a heartbeat. But this time, the planchette moved without my touch. It spelled words I didn't understand, words in a language that felt older than the room itself. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Yet there was a part of me that craved these dreams, these whispers of something vast and incomprehensible. One particularly vivid dream stood out. The board was no longer on the floor but suspended midair, surrounded by shadows that seemed alive. The planchette spelled out one word repeatedly, become. When I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a dream. It was an invitation. I started experimenting. At first, it was small things. simple spells I found in dusty grimoires, incantations that promised to reveal hidden truths or grant minor wishes. Most of them were harmless, or so I thought, but each success, however small, filled me with a hunger for more. The fear I once felt was replaced by a cold determination to uncover the limits of what I could do. College was a turning point. Away from the prying eyes of family and the mundane expectations of small-town life, I had the freedom to dive deeper. I found others who shared my interests, a loose group of misfits and seekers who met in forgotten corners of the campus. We exchanged knowledge, held rituals, and pushed boundaries. It was thrilling, intoxicating, but I always felt like an outsider among them. They played with the dark. I wanted to own it. One night, during a particularly intense ritual, I felt something stir inside me. We had gathered in an abandoned building on the edge of town, its walls covered in graffiti and its floors littered with broken glass. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs and candle wax. We were attempting to summon a spirit, though I suspected none of them truly believed it would work. But I did. As the chanting reached its peak, I felt a sudden surge of energy, a rush of cold fire that spread through my veins. The candles flickered wildly, and for a brief moment, the shadows in the room seemed to take on forms, twisting, writhing, reaching. The others froze, their voices faltering, but I kept going. I could feel it, the presence of something vast and ancient, something that recognized me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The response wasn't in words, but in a flood of images and sensations. A vast, starless void, a sense of endless hunger. And then, a single word burned into my mind: destiny. When the ritual ended, the others were shaken. Some dismissed it as a trick of the mind, a collective hallucination brought on by the intensity of the moment. But I knew better. I'd felt it. I'd been chosen. From that point on, I was different. The world seemed smaller, its rules more pliable. I began to see patterns in the chaos, connections that others missed. And always, in the back of my mind, there was the echo of that night, the whisper of the void. "Become," it said, and I intended to. Years passed, and the echoes of the void grew stronger, more insistent. What had once been whispers became a steady, unyielding drumbeat in my mind. I tried to live a normal life, or at least the facade of one. A steady job, polite smiles at coworkers, the occasional visit home to see my aging parents. But beneath it all, the darkness churned. It was never far away, waiting for a moment of weakness to pull me back into its embrace. The dreams continued, but they had changed. No longer was I merely an observer. Now, I was a participant. The Ouija board reappeared often, but it was different, almost alive. The letters glowed fiercely, and the planchette moved with a force that seemed to defy logic. In these dreams, I wasn't asking questions anymore. I was answering them, and the questions were always the same. "Are you ready?" My answer was always yes, though the meaning of my response eluded me. Ready for what? Ready to become what? Then came the incidents. At first, they were small, almost laughable. A coworker's computer crashing moments before a critical presentation. A stranger's tire blowing out just as they cut me off in traffic. I'd feel a twinge of satisfaction, a sense of control over the chaos around me. But as the incidents escalated, so did my unease. One evening, as I walked home from work, I noticed a man following me. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his gaze, heavy and unrelenting. Fear gripped me, and I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. When I turned a corner and found myself alone in a narrow alley, I knew I had made a mistake. He appeared at the mouth of the alley, his silhouette sharp against the dim streetlights. "Give me your wallet," he demanded, his voice low and threatening. My hands trembled as I reached for my pocket, but then something inside me snapped. A surge of icy power coursed through my veins, and I raised my eyes to meet his. "No," I said, my voice unnaturally calm. He hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. That's when it happened. The streetlights above us flickered, then burst, plunging the alley into darkness. The air grew heavy, and the temperature plummeted. I saw his shadowy form stumble backward, his breathing ragged and panicked. "Stay away from me," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by a deafening silence that seemed to swallow the world around us. When the lights returned, he was gone. The only evidence of his presence was a faint scorch mark on the ground where he had stood. I stood there, trembling, a mix of fear and exhilaration flooding my senses. I'd tapped into something vast and unknowable, something that felt like a part of me. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. Who was I becoming? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the void whispered its approval. "Become," it urged, louder than ever. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lit a candle and retrieved the battered Ouija board I'd kept hidden all these years. Placing my hands on the planchette, I asked the only question that mattered. What must I do? The planchette moved with purpose, faster than I'd ever seen it before. It spelled out a single word: awaken. The answer from the board lingered in my mind. Awaken. It was both a command and a promise, a word heavy with meaning that I couldn't yet grasp. But I would. The void within me demanded it, and I had no intention of resisting. I spent the following weeks preparing, though for what, I wasn't entirely sure. My nights were consumed with study and ritual, my days a fog of disconnection from the mundane world around me. It started with the mirrors. Their surfaces no longer reflected just my image, but flickered with shadows and shapes that seemed to exist in a realm just beyond my comprehension. At first, I avoided looking directly at them, unnerved by the sight. But soon, curiosity overcame fear. I stared into them, letting the shadows dance and morph, their movements speaking to me in a language I was beginning to understand. Then came the voices. They were faint at first, whispers that seemed to emanate from the edges of my consciousness. Over time, they grew louder, more distinct. They spoke of things I had no way of knowing, secrets that weren't mine but felt as though they always had been. They guided me to books, artifacts, and places I would never have found on my own. And they spoke of the awakening. The final ritual was unlike anything I had ever attempted. The instructions had come to me in fragments, a dream here, a whispered suggestion there. I pieced them together meticulously, knowing that failure was not an option. On the appointed night, under a moonless sky, I stood in the center of my apartment, the furniture pushed aside to make room for the intricate symbols I had drawn on the floor. Candles burned at each corner, their flames unnaturally still despite the oppressive atmosphere. I placed the Ouija board at the center of the largest symbol, the planchette ready for my touch. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation. I could feel the void pressing against the boundaries of my reality, eager to breach them. I took a deep breath and began. The words came easily, flowing from my lips like they had always been there, waiting. The shadows around me deepened, pooling together until they formed a single entity that loomed over the board. Its presence was overwhelming, a mix of terror and awe that threatened to consume me. But I held firm. I had come too far to falter now. "I am ready," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling around me. The entity didn't speak, but I felt its response, a surge of power that coursed through me, igniting every nerve, every cell. The planchette moved on its own, faster than I could follow. When it stopped, the board spelled out a final message. "You are the void." In that moment, I understood. The whispers, the shadows, the board, they had all been leading to this. I was not a mere conduit for the darkness. I was its vessel, its avatar. The void wasn't something outside of me. It was me. The world around me seemed to dissolve, replaced by a vast, endless expanse of nothingness. Yet it wasn't empty. It was full of potential, of creation and destruction intertwined. I stood at the center of it all, a being of infinite possibilities. When I returned to the apartment, it was as if no time had passed. The candles were still burning, the symbols still etched into the floor. But I was different. The world seemed brighter, sharper, and under my control. I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The next day, I walked through the city, a predator among prey. I could feel the fear, the hope, the secrets of everyone around me. They were open books, their lives malleable in my hands. I didn't need the board anymore. The void had awakened within me, and its power was mine to wield. And so, I became, not just a person, but something more. A force, a shadow, a god among mortals. The Ouija board, that small, seemingly innocuous relic, had unlocked my destiny, and I embraced it with open arms.